Major funding for Road to Liberty Through Their Eyes was provided by the S. Dillard and Adrian Kirby Family Philanthropic Fund and by the Community Foundation of New Jersey, Princeton Partners, and the New Jersey Historic Trust. Additional funding was provided by the Kane Foundation, the F. M. Kirby Foundation, the New Jersey Historical Commission, the New Jersey Education Association, Edward E. and Mary M. Wendell, Jackie and Plato Stirius, and John T. Daniel.
On April 19, 1775, 700 redcoats are on the march to Concord to seize the rebellious Massachusetts militia's stockpile of weapons and gunpowder. Along the way, they encounter about 80 militiamen on Lexington Common watching them pass by. But the redcoats stop to confront them. Nobody knows who fired the first shot heard round the world, but the redcoats opened fire, killing 8 militiamen, which set the Patriots on the road to liberty. Over the next 2 years, the Patriots will trudge along this road that's fraught with dangers within.
It became a very tense situation between those who supported the cause of liberty and those who supported loyalty to the king, to the point where it really became a civil war in many ways.
And the road was littered with defeats and retreats when this fledgling nation was at its most vulnerable as the Patriots struggle against the British Crown and its mighty army and Royal Navy in their fight for liberty. As the Redcoats continue their march to Concord, word spread like wildfire, and militias and Minutemen raced from all over Massachusetts to defend Concord and Lexington and avenge their fallen brothers. The militias attacked the Redcoats posted at Northbridge, forcing the British soldiers to retreat. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, in charge of the British raid, sends some of his grenadiers to rescue the beleaguered Redcoats at Northbridge and orders his troops to march back to Boston. The militias and Minutemen keep arriving and have set up a gauntlet along the route to Boston to harass the Redcoats, attacking them from all sides and causing many British casualties.
Our men had very few opportunities of getting good shots at the rebels, as they hardly ever fired but under cover of a stone wall, from behind a tree or out of a house, and the moment they had fired, they lay down out of sight until they had loaded again.
The battles of Lexington and Concord may have ignited the American Revolutionary War in 1775, but this confrontation between many of the colonists and the King's troops was the culmination of over a decade of grievances the colonists endured.
We can really go back all the way to the Stamp Act in 1765. The Stamp Act taxed people directly in their pocketbooks for everything they needed: licenses, stamps, newspapers, and that was really the beginning of it.
Declaring no taxation without representation, riots broke out as colonists took to the streets to protest the Stamp Act, demanding that the British Parliament repeal it, which they did. But it was the calm before the storm, because Parliament replaced the Stamp Act with the Townshend Acts in 1767 that taxed imported goods to raise revenue for the Crown. This enraged the colonists and protests erupted again. Then came the Tea Act in 1773 that inflamed the Sons of Liberty, who organized the Boston Tea Party in December 1773 and dumped tons of tea into Boston Harbor. In retaliation, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts in March 1774, which the colonists called intolerable. These acts closed the port of Boston, imposed martial law, ended self-government, and enacted the new Quartering Act.
It became an occupation of their land. That's how it was viewed by the colonists. No longer were they under the protection of the Crown, but they were under the occupation of the Crown.
But not all colonists wanted to break away.
The Patriots called Loyalists Tories. It was not meant as a compliment. Tory and Whig were political parties at the time. The Loyalists referred to their enemies as the Whigs or the rebels, never as patriots, of course.
There were fractions within families There were factions within social groups and communities between those who supported liberty and those who still supported the king, to the point of sometimes outward violence, one group towards the other.
Even before hostilities had commenced, tarring and feathering of loyalists, or another most unhappy torture called riding the rail, were used against loyalists for speaking their mind.
Reinforced by many New England militias following the battles of Lexington and Concord, over 15,000 Patriot soldiers dug in and laid siege to the city of Boston. When news reached Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress was convened on May 10, 1775. After much discussion, the delegates voted to reorganize the New England militias into the Continental Army.
In colonial times, a standing army was seen as a threat to the populace. And this was actually one of the things that drew a lot of friction between the colonists and the mother country.
The delegates unanimously appointed George Washington as commander-in-chief on June 15, 1775. I feel great distress from a consciousness that my abilities and military experience may not be equal to the extensive and important trust. However, as the Congress desire it, I will enter upon the momentous duty and exert every power I possess in their service and for the support of the glorious cause. Washington's pledge to give Congress civilian authority over the military was important because colonists believed the Crown's standing army was the cause of their many grievances.
At this point in the war, before the Declaration of Independence, it was a battle for redress of grievances between the Americans and the British. It was not for independence.
While General Washington is accepting his appointment in Philadelphia, the New England militias have built fortifications on Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill to prevent the Redcoats from breaking out of Boston, but the British attack them on June 17, 1775, in an effort to end the siege.
As the enemy approached, our men was not only exposed to the attack of a very numerous musketry, but to the heavy fire of the battery on Copp's Hill. Notwithstanding, we sustained the enemy's attack with great bravery and resolution, killed and wounded great numbers, and repulsed them several times.
The Crown's ministerial army claimed victory, but it came at the cost of over 1,000 casualties, and the New England militias successfully prevent the Redcoats from breaking the siege.
The number of the killed and wounded is greater than our force can afford to lose. The officers who were obliged to exert themselves have suffered very much, and we have lost some extraordinary good officers.
General George Washington arrived in Cambridge and took command of the Continental Army on July 3, 1775, with the daunting task of leading an army made up of New England militias who have only signed up for short enlistments.
They are used to serving for very short durations, responding to an emergency, and when that emergency is over, going back to their normal lives as civilians.
Short enlistments are just one concern Washington has with the militias. There are several others. From the number of boys, deserters, and Negroes which have been enlisted in the troops of this province, I entertain some doubts whether the number required can be raised here. With congressional approval, Washington immediately orders his Adjutant General Horatio Gates to ban blacks, free or slave, from serving in the Continental Army.
You are not to enlist any deserter from the ministerial army, nor any stroller, Negro, or vagabond, or person suspected of being an enemy to the liberty of America.
This incensed black and mixed-race soldiers who are already serving. In his book, The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, which was printed in 1855, William C. Nell collected oral stories from many blacks who served in the war.
Besides Salem, there was quite a number of colored soldiers at Bunker Hill. Among them, Titus Coburn, Alexander Ames, and Barzillai Lew, all of Andover, and also Cato Howe of Plymouth, each of whom received a pension.
But even though enlistments for 1776 were not meeting the quota, Washington stood firm on the ban. Neither Negroes, boys unable to bear arms, nor old men unfit to endure the fatigues of the campaign are to be enlisted. However, most blacks already serving want to re-enlist and vent their anger about the ban.
It was a strong argument. We've already been here. Here you come lately, after we've already fought in battles and had buried our dead, and then come and tell us that, we're not eligible to serve.
Colonel John Glover and his Marblehead Regiment was a well-disciplined, integrated militia that wants to fight for liberty.
The vast majority of the men in my Marblehead Regiment are fishermen. They've worked together. They've fished on the treacherous Grand Banks. They've taken trips to the Caribbean. And they have that seafaring experience.
Being maritime, you really don't care as much what color the person is aboard the ship if they're holding the rope that saves your life.
In November, word arrived that Lord Dunmore, Royal Governor of Virginia, had issued a proclamation.
I do hereby further declare all indented servants, Negroes, or others appertaining to rebels, free, that are able and willing to bear arms, they joining His Majesty's troops as soon as may be, for the more speedily reducing this colony to a proper sense of their duty.
The dilemma for an African American during this period is that, do I go for immediate emancipation with the British, or do I go with this Virginia slaveholder who didn't even want us in the army?
Within the first month of issuing the proclamation, at least 300 enslaved blacks escape from their masters and enlist in Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. News of the Ethiopian Regiment motivated Washington to request that Congress make an exception to its ban on free blacks. It has been represented to me that the free Negroes who have served in this army are very much dissatisfied at being discarded, as it is to be apprehended that they may seek employ in the ministerial army. I have presumed to depart from the resolution respecting them, and have given license for their being enlisted. Congress approved, and free black patriot soldiers who had fought in 1775 were able to re-enlist in 1776. Washington knew he did not have enough cannon to end the siege of Boston and orders Colonel Henry Knox, his 25-year-old commander of artillery, to retrieve the British cannon left at Fort Ticonderoga following the Patriots' victory back in May 1775. Knox sets out with a budget of £1,000 to achieve this impossible task in the dead of winter.
I have made 42 exceeding strong sleds and have provided 80 yoke of oxen to drag them as far as Springfield. I hope in 16 or 17 days to be able to present to your excellency a noble train of artillery, the inventory of which I've enclosed.
It took a little longer, but thanks to his extraordinary resolve and the perseverance of his crew, Knox arrives back in Cambridge with a cannon on January 24, 1776. Then one night in early March, Washington orders his troops to fortify Dorchester Heights with these cannon where, from this vantage point, the Patriots could bombard the city and the British naval ships in the harbor.
The rebels have done more in one night than my whole army would have done in a month.
General William Howe, who replaced Thomas Gage as the new military governor and commander-in-chief of the Crown's ministerial army, decides he would risk too many lives if he attacked the Patriots on Dorchester Heights. But no shots were fired as the Patriots watched 9,000 troops board their ships, along with about 1,000 loyalists who chose to flee their homes rather than risk facing the wrath of patriots. The Patriots celebrate their victory as General Howe and the British fleet head to Halifax to await reinforcements, while Washington and his army head to Manhattan in April to complete fortifications and defend the city.
Right around the beginning of July of 1776, General William Howe led his forces from Halifax, Nova Scotia, about 9,000 men in total, to Staten Island, New York Harbor. The war that had started outside of Boston on April 1775 had now come to New York City.
General Howe landed his troops on Staten Island unopposed, poised to capture New York City and crush the rebellion. He was greeted by Royal Governor Tryon and many loyalists who felt safe now that they were under British protection.
They could huzzah for King George in safety with British troops protecting them. Also, many set out to join the army, taking up arms for the British, where they could do that on Staten Island.
Within days of the British arriving, the Second Continental Congress approved the Resolution of Independence on July 2, 1776, and the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, which explains its decision to renounce British rule. Washington has the Declaration read to his troops and informs them that they are now fighting for their own country, the United States of America. To celebrate their independence, some citizens descend on Bowling Green and pull down King George III's statue.
The lead, we hear, is to be run up into musket balls for the use of the Yankees, when it is hoped that the emanations of the leaden George will make as deep impressions in the bodies of some of his red-coated and Tory subjects.
Meanwhile, Admiral Lord Richard Howe, commander of the Royal Navy, arrives from England with troops, along with British ships returning from Charleston and ships from Germany carrying Hessian troops.
In terms of the number of troops, about 24,000 ground troops, and then another 10,000 sailors.
By the summer of 1776, Washington had gathered an army of 20,000 men in this area, and more were on the way. But they needed to station these folks in New Jersey, Long Island, New York City itself, up the Hudson Valley, to make sure that the British would not get a foothold.
Even though the Howe brothers are Whigs with some sympathy for the colonists, they are also close friends and loyal to King George III, which is why he chose them to command his army and navy and crush the rebellion.
They were not only given command of the Royal Navy and the Army, but they were also the peace commissioners.
Admiral Lord Howe sent General Washington a letter requesting a meeting, but the letter was returned unopened because it was addressed incorrectly.
Admiral Lord Howe and General Howe hold you in the highest esteem, Your Excellency, and regret the difficulties with respect to the address on the letter they sent.
You must understand, sir, that I have to decline any letter sent to me as a private person which relates to my public station as General and Commander-in-Chief.
I do understand, Your Excellency, but please allow me to proceed to a more pressing matter. Lord Howe and General Howe want you to know that through the goodness and benevolence of the King, they have the power to grant pardons in order to end this unhappy dispute.
Frankly, Colonel, we have committed no fault and want no pardon. We are defending what we deem our indisputable rights.
When the Howe brothers receive Washington's response, they begin preparations for their plan of attack. General Nathanael Greene believes the Howes will attack Long Island first to secure the East River, but Washington thinks Manhattan is their target. On August 22, 1776, the Howes begin to land 15,000 Redcoats and 5,000 Hessians on Long Island at Gravesend Bay. I have detached from hence 6 battalions as a reinforcement to our troops there, which are all that I can spare at this time, not knowing but the fleet may move up with the remainder of their army and make an attack here at the next flood tide. General Greene has built a line of forts to protect Brooklyn Heights and the East River from a land attack, and Washington assigns General John Sullivan and Major General William Alexander, known as Lord Stirling, to form the front line of defense on the heights of Guan and defend the passes leading from the flatlands of Long Island to Brooklyn Heights.
They were able to defend the first 3 passes, Marten's Lane, Flatbush, and Bedford, with a sizable number of men, about 3,300 men altogether on the ridge. The problem was that there was a 4th pass, the Jamaica Pass.
Located about 4 miles from the Patriots' front line of defense, Sullivan posts only 5 horsemen to patrol Jamaica Pass. What Sullivan didn't take into account was that Loyalists were very willing to help the British.
The British never went anywhere without local Loyalist guides, people who knew the countryside. In that respect, they were invaluable to British plans.
When General Henry Clinton, Howe's second-in-command, learns from Loyalists that there is a rarely used pass in the mountains that is undefended, he devises a plan to outflank the rebels' front line of defense on the heights of Guan.
And he presented it to General Howe, and it was scoffed at first, and then ultimately accepted.
Howe orders General James Grant and General von Heister to harass the rebels at Martin's Lane and Flatbush Pass to make them believe the main attack had begun. But this was just a ploy to distract the Patriots' front line.
On the night of the 26th, the British put in motion a night march and send this column of 10,000 men and cavalry and cannon through the Jamaica Pass, putting them behind the Americans on the ridge and encircling American position. And that was the warning shot to Grant and to von Heister that the trap was in place and that they should now press their attacks so that the trap would then close.
This unexpected attack threw them into confusion. Their left was thrown back upon their right, and both reduced to a sauve-qui-peut over bays, marshes, creeks, etc. In short, had all answered as we wished, not a man could have escaped.
But some did escape. In his book written years later, Private Joseph Plum Martin, who was 15 at the time, vividly describes the carnage he saw.
We now began to meet the wounded men, another sight I was unacquainted with. Some with broken arms, some with broken legs, and some with broken heads.
Washington has crossed over from Manhattan and observes the annihilation of his front line from Cobble Hill Fort.
Washington utters the words, "What brave men I must lose this day," because he sees his men, some of whom were drowning, trying to cross a water feature, and many of whom were being captured, and the battle that occurs around the old stone house with the Maryland 400.
The British are victorious, inflicting heavy casualties on the American forces and capturing over 1,000 soldiers, including Sullivan and Lord Stirling. General Clinton and other officers wanted to attack Brooklyn Heights immediately and put an end to the rebellion, but General Howe orders them to stand down.
It was not necessary to do that the East River was to Washington's back, that Washington was not going anywhere, that he could avoid casualties and at the same time accomplish what he hoped to do, which was capture Washington and his troops and effectively end the Revolutionary War.
Providence steps in the next day when severe rainstorms and high winds prevent the Royal Navy from sailing up the East River to bombard Brooklyn Heights. At a council of war on August 29th, Washington's generals make the case that they must evacuate. Washington agrees and orders every boat on the East River to be delivered to the ferry landing. A nor'easter was gathering strength, and he calls on Colonel John Glover and his Marblehead Regiment, along with other seafaring regiments from Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, to man the boats. None of the soldiers are told about the evacuation for fear word would get back to the British.
We were strictly enjoined not to speak or even cough while on the march. All orders were given from officer to officer and communicated to the men in whispers. What such secrecy could mean we could not divine.
The task to transport 9,000 soldiers, their equipment, and their horses across the river at night during a nor'easter was daunting.
Time was at a premium. The nightfall that we would have to ferry all 9,000 across to safety was a minimal window in and of itself.
And the 1,000 men who have been left in the trenches, they think that they have been sacrificed because the sun's come up and the game is over.
But once again, Providence steps in.
There was a great fog that set in across the river. Dense banks of glowing mist, impossible for the British to see us, so we were able to ferry the rest of the men across, thanks be to God.
The Howe brothers reach out to the Second Continental Congress to send delegates to Staten Island to discuss a negotiated peace. The meeting was cordial, but after 3 hours, nothing was resolved. The delegates left, and the Howe brothers planned their next move to end the rebellion.
All of a sudden, there came such a peal of thunder from the British shipping that I thought my head would go with the sound. I made a frog's leap for the ditch and lay as still as I possibly could.
Young Joseph Plum Martin was manning the lines at Kipps Bay when the first salvo was fired from 5 British warships, including the Phoenix and Rose.
We kept the lines until they were almost leveled upon us, when our officers, seeing we could make no resistance, gave the order to leave the lines.
As the Patriots retreat from the British onslaught, Washington came galloping in, disregarding his own safety, and tries to rally them.
They were so panic-struck that even the shadow of an enemy seemed to increase their precipitate flight. His Excellency, distressed and enraged, drew his sword and snapped his pistols to check them, but they continued their flight without firing a gun.
Washington is infuriated at not being able to halt the rout, throws his hat on the ground, and cries out, "Are these the men with whom I am to defend America?" If the generality of our troops would behave with tolerable bravery, but experience to my extreme affliction has convinced me that this is rather to be wished for than expected. Receiving orders from Washington, General Putnam leads 3,500 troops from Lower Manhattan to Harlem Heights and could easily have been cut off and captured by General Howe.
Most fortunately, the British generals, seeing no prospect of engaging our troops, halted their own and repaired to the house of a Mr. Robert Murray, a Quaker and friend of our cause. Mrs. Murray treated them with cake and wine, and they were induced to tarry 2 hours or more.
General Howe's decision to halt his advance until all his troops have landed at Kipps Bay did save most of Putnam's troops. But the Howes have achieved their goal of occupying New York City. When young Joseph Plum Martin got to Harlem Heights, he meets up with his Connecticut company, and they were back in action the very next day, defending Harlem Heights, which ends in victory for Washington and the Patriots.
The troops engaged, being reinforced by our regiment. We remained on the battleground till nearly sunset, expecting the enemy to attack us again, but they showed no such inclination that day. The men were very much fatigued and faint, having had nothing to eat for 48 hours.
Earlier in the month, Washington had posed the question to Congress regarding whether to burn Lower Manhattan or not. If we should be obliged to abandon the town, ought it to stand as winter quarters for the enemy? They would derive great conveniences from it on the one hand, and much property would be destroyed on the other. Washington leaned towards destroying Lower Manhattan, but Congress responded that it should not be damaged. Yet, on the night of September 20th, fire broke out in the city, destroying Trinity Church and hundreds of buildings in Lower Manhattan. I had forgot to mention that Providence, or some good, honest fellow, has done more for us than we were disposed to do for ourselves, as near 1/4 of the city is supposed to be consumed. In October 1776, Washington welcomes back General Charles Lee, his second-in-command, from Lee's victory in Charleston, South Carolina, and renames Fort Constitution Fort Lee in his honor.
And General Lee has returned from the South. He's advising a full retreat. Let's give up. They've got most of Manhattan Island. They're going to get the rest.
Washington agrees and prepares to move his army and supplies to White Plains, with one exception.
General Greene recommends to General Washington that they keep Fort Washington as a stronghold.
Even though the two forts and the sunken Chevaux de Frise that was meant to serve as a barrier had not impeded many British ships from sailing up the river, Washington defers to Greene's judgment. Colonel Glover was promoted to command a brigade assigned to General Lee's division, totaling about 750 soldiers. To guard against the British cutting off the Army's retreat to White Plains, Lee orders Glover's brigade to Eastchester to overlook Pelham Bay and report back immediately if they see British troops landing.
When I had approached the top of an eminence, with my spyglass I looked out over the Sound and was horrified by what I saw. A large number of British ships were preparing to land at Pell's Point with thousands of infantry.
Glover knows the British Army must use Split Rock Road to march to White Plains. This road is lined on each side by stone walls, and Glover posts 3 of his regiments behind the stone walls in a staggered formation to ambush the Redcoats and Hessians.
We fought dearly in that delaying action at Pell's Point and helped to save the general once again, not this time on the waters, but this time fighting his infantry on the land.
After several hours of attacks, Glover orders a retreat. But this was another costly British victory in terms of casualties. Glover's brigade receives thanks from both Lee and Washington in their general orders. Washington uses his general order as an example to show how all his soldiers should behave. He hopes that every other part of the army will do their duty with bravery and zeal whenever called upon, and neither dangers nor difficulties nor hardships will discourage soldiers engaged in the cause of liberty. Glover's brigade rejoins Lee's division and sets up artillery on Miller Hill in White Plains, while Washington posts some of his militias on Chatterton's Hill, which the Hessians attack on October 28th.
A lot of the troops panic. There's chaos as cannonballs land and disrupt their equipment, blow up guns. They retreat down the back of the hill, cross the river to the main American position. And some of the more seasoned troops do stand their ground and inflict pretty heavy casualties on the British.
Following defeat at Chatterton's Hill, Washington's troops retreat to North Castle, and Washington moves his headquarters to Miller House, home of widow Ann Miller. On November 4th, Glover's brigade fired cannon from Miller Hill onto General Howe's troops below to cover Washington's retreat.
And to hear the sound of a 12-pound cannon fired from above your home, you can't describe it. It's more than thunder. It's terrifying. And muskets firing all the time. There was smoke from the cannon fire and the muskets that clogged the air, and the sound just never stopped. It was terrifying for the children.
Miller Hill is where the Americans entrench, and they fire on the British, and Howe basically decides he's going to give up the chase at this point.
Ann Miller is a patriot whose husband was mortally wounded at the Battle of Brooklyn. She was devastated to learn that Major John Austin of Massachusetts set fire to her town after the British had left.
We were furious. How could someone who says that they're loyal to our cause come through and burn what we need to survive after they've gone?
When Washington was informed that General Howe and his troops were heading south, he was concerned. Where was Howe going next? And Washington divides his army, leaving the main army under the command of General Lee to protect the New England states, while he crosses the Hudson with about 2,000 troops to join up with Greene at Fort Lee. Washington sends a letter to Greene suggesting that Fort Washington should be evacuated. I am therefore inclined to think it will not be prudent to hazard the men and stores at Mount Washington, but as you are on the spot, leave it to you to give such orders as to evacuating Mount Washington as you judge best. However, General Greene and the fort's commander, Colonel Robert McGaw, are certain the fort could withstand any attack, and Greene sends troops from Fort Lee to increase the garrison's strength from 1,200 to over 2,800 soldiers.
The British attacked on November 16th from all different sides, from the north, from the south, and from Harlem Creek.
The American front lines fought valiantly against the onslaught of redcoats and Hessians. In one instance, when Margaret Corbin's husband was killed, she took over the cannon to continue the fight.
She is serving the cause. This is heroic action. But they are firing back, and she is hit by grape shot. Margaret Corbin is shot here, left side, above the breast, into the shoulder, into the arm. She is, of course, then totally disabled. So she sinks to the ground amidst the other dead, dying, wounded. The Hessians come up and they take her prisoner.
The British break through the front lines and force the Patriot soldiers into the fort, where McGaw has no choice but to surrender.
It was one of the saddest sights I believe I've ever seen, I've ever witnessed. I watched through my spyglass. It was a devastating loss of so many good men.
Many of the Patriot soldiers taken prisoner that day were thrown into prison ships on the East River under horrible conditions. Many died from disease or starvation, whereas officers fared better and were often released through prisoner exchanges. 4 days later, General Charles Cornwallis lands 5,000 British troops on the Jersey side of the North River at the foot of the Palisades just a few miles north of Fort Lee. Guided by 3 Bergen County Loyalists to a steep, narrow, rocky path that leads straight to the top of the cliff, Cornwallis and his division, with all their artillery, muskets, and supplies, managed to climb to the top of this path and march south to attack Fort Lee.
General Greene had already been alerted, and according to witnesses, within 7 minutes, the garrison was on its march out of Fort Lee.
But a skirmish erupts the next day when British troops attack the American rear guard who are dismantling Newbridge to slow the British down. Even though they were outnumbered, the Patriots put up a good fight that enables Washington to stay just ahead of Cornwallis as he retreats across the Jerseys. Washington begins to send letters to Lee requesting that he bring his division to New Jersey immediately to join him.
The letters that would go back and forth between Charles Lee and George Washington, he wanted those troops. He wanted to consolidate his army.
But Lee was in no hurry to help Washington, and murmurings among some of the officers begin to surface that Lee would be a better choice as commander-in-chief. Even Washington's secretary, Colonel Joseph Reed, voices his concern.
"Oh, General, an indecisive mind is one of the greatest misfortunes that can befall an army.
How often have I lamented at this campaign? All circumstances considered, we are in a very awful and alarming state.
Lee replies to Reed in a private letter which Washington inadvertently opens and reads, thinking it was official business.
I received your most obliging, flattering letter. Lament with you that fatal indecision of mine.
With winter fast approaching, morale is low amongst the troops. There are desertions, disease, enlistments are expiring, many soldiers have not been paid, and the army lacks supplies like tents, blankets, and winter clothing.
To have to lie as I did almost every night, for our duty required it, on the cold and often wet ground without a blanket and with nothing but thin summer clothing, was tedious.
We encamped in the woods with no victual, no tents, no blankets. The night was cold and we all suffered much.
Lee uses lack of supplies as another excuse for delaying his move to join Washington in the Jerseys. I have received your favor of the 20th and feel with you the distresses of the army for want of necessary clothing and covering. I have pointed this out to Congress several times. How to remedy it, I know not. As Cornwallis gives chase to Washington's retreating army and occupies Hackensack, Newark, and Elizabethtown for the crown, the Howe brothers once again issue their proclamation granting a full pardon to any rebel who pledges allegiance to the crown, and several thousand citizens take the pledge, which infuriates Washington. The conduct of the Jerseys has been most infamous. Instead of turning out to defend their country and affording aid to our army, they are making their submissions as fast as they can. In one day, Washington loses over 2,500 soldiers whose enlistments have expired, leaving him with only 3,000 soldiers to face the British.
These were the survivors. These were the soldiers, many of them New England regiments, who had stuck with Washington all the way through the New York campaign.
They were totally outnumbered, and if they had gotten into battle, they would certainly have lost, and the revolution could have ended in the retreat across New Jersey.
General Howe orders Cornwallis not to cross the Raritan River until he arrives with reinforcements, but this delay gives Washington time to reorganize the remnants of his army and put a barrier between his troops and Cornwallis.
To ensure that they would not be followed, he started sending out orders on December 2nd to multiple militia units to collect up all of the watercraft and pay particular attention to those Durham boats, which were really the tractor-trailer trucks of the day on the Delaware River.
General Howe orders Cornwallis to take on Washington in Trenton, but he's a day late and discovers that the rebels have already set up encampments on the banks of the Delaware River in Pennsylvania at strategic river crossings, and that there were no boats to be found.
And it was basically because of that that they decided to go into winter quarters about December 14th.
Washington assigns his troops to guard the river crossings, but desperately needs reinforcements in order to take action against the British before the end of the year. I must entreat you to hasten your march as much as possible, or your arrival may be too late to answer any valuable purpose.
Lee didn't want to follow those orders. Lee wanted to be boss.
Washington sends an appeal to Congress to get rid of short enlistments when new recruits sign on in January 1777. My first wish is that Congress may be convinced of the impropriety of relying upon the militia and of the necessity of raising a larger standing army than what they have voted. With the threat of attack on Philadelphia, Congress moves to Baltimore on December 12th and leaves Washington in charge of the army to find a way to turn things around.
Washington was in the hot seat. He was the one who was given command of the army, and it had been a complete disaster.
Washington puts a plan together with his generals, but knows he can only execute it if reinforcements arrive before his army's enlistments expire on December 31st.
When Howe went into winter quarters, he spread his troops across New Jersey in various small cantonments, and one of those cantonments was going to be at Trenton.
To understand what the British are doing across the river, Washington uses a trusted spy to provide him with good intelligence.
Washington learned that every one of those outposts, his troops outnumbered. If they all got together, they would outnumber him. But so long as they were spread out into those cantonments, he was stronger than any of them personnel-wise.
Washington's plan was in place, but where were the reinforcements? I have no certain intelligence of General Lee, although I have sent frequent expresses to him. I cannot account for the slowness of his march. General Lee's division was encamped at Bernardsville, and on the evening of December 12th, Lee and an entourage of officers and guards spent the night at Widow White's Tavern in Basking Ridge, about 4 miles from his division. In the morning, Lee was replying to a dispatch sent to him by General Horatio Gates and uses his response to malign Washington.
This ingenious maneuver of Fort Washington has unhinged the goodly fabric we had been building. There never was so damned a stroke. Entre nous, a certain great man is most damnably deficient.
Overnight, a loyalist had informed the British of Lee's whereabouts, and the 16th Dragoons surround Widow White's Tavern and demand Lee's surrender. With no place to hide, Lee is forced to surrender, and General John Sullivan, Lee's second-in-command, informs Washington of the loss. Our cause has also received a severe blow in the captivity of General Lee, unhappy man. Taken by his own imprudence, going 3 or 4 miles from his own camp and within 20 of the enemy. This news is devastating to the Army's New England soldiers who have served with Washington and Lee through thick and thin and are counting the days when their enlistments expire at the end of the year, a huge problem confronting Washington. Publicly, Washington continues to urge Congress not to depend on the militias and expand the Army. These, sir, are the men I am to depend upon. 10 days hence, this is the basis on which your cause will and must forever depend, till you get a large standing army sufficient of itself to oppose the enemy. Washington also asks Congress to consider a bold suggestion while they are located in Baltimore that would help him make decisions about the Army without their approval. It may be said that this is an application for powers that are too dangerous to be entrusted. I can only add that desperate diseases require desperate remedies. Washington expresses his true frustrations and doubts in a private letter to his brother. I think our affairs are in a very bad situation. Not so much from the apprehension of General Howe's army as from the defection of New York, Jersey, and Pennsylvania. In a word, my dear sir, if every nerve is not strained to recruit the new army with all possible expedition, I think the game is pretty near up. Thomas Paine has completed the first in a series of pamphlets called The American Crisis and published it in the Pennsylvania Journal on December 19th, which Washington orders his officers to read to all of the troops.
These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman.
All of a sudden, the troops' morale get a boost on December 20th, when Sullivan arrives with Lee's troops, which included Colonel Glover's 14th Continental Regiment.
The army was in a depleted and demoralized condition, and there was great cheering when they encountered us and saw that we were there to help bolster their forces towards the end of the year.
At the same time, reinforcements were arriving from New England, Pennsylvania, Maryland, New Jersey, and New York.
Continental Army doubles in size essentially overnight, and General Washington is thrilled, and now we get to see the fruition of the plan.
Originally, Washington planned a 3-pronged attack from 3 different river crossings to converge on Trenton in the early hours of December 26th. His troops are located 9 miles upriver from Trenton, and he puts Colonel Knox in charge of the crossing, who insists on bringing 18 cannon.
They're the foul weather weapon of the 18th century, not affected by the snowstorm, where the shoulder arms, the flintlock muskets, when they become wet, you can't get sparks to ignite wet gunpowder.
Knox assigns Glover's regiment and a Pennsylvania regiment to man the Durham boats and row the troops across the river, while he oversees the loading of the cannon and horses onto the ferries.
I was with the first that crossed. We had to wait for the rest, and so began to pull down the fences and make fires to warm ourselves, for the storm was increasing rapidly. After a while, it rained, hailed, snowed, and froze, and at the same time blew a perfect hurricane.
Early on in the night, my men were able to pierce those sheets of ice with their oars. But as time grew, the polemen were forced to smash and bash at the ice just to clear a path to get across.
The noise of the soldiers coming over and clearing away the ice, the rattling of the cannon wheels on the frozen ground, and the cheerfulness of my fellow comrades encouraged me beyond expression.
Washington learned that the other two crossings have failed due to ice clogging the river, which was also delaying his crossing. But this was his last chance to attack Trenton, and he was determined to see it through. The watchword of the night, victory or death.
He didn't get everybody across till about 3 o'clock and didn't actually leave to march to Trenton until closer to 4 o'clock.
This was a tough march. 9 miles across Jacobs Creek. Took them almost an hour to get across that ravine.
I heard His Excellency as he was coming on speaking to and encouraging the soldiers. The words he spoke as he passed by where I stood and in my hearing were these: "Soldiers, keep by officers. For God's sakes, keep by your officers." Spoke in a deep and solemn voice.
I recollect very well that at one time, when we were halted on the road, I sat down on the stump of a tree and was so benumbed with cold that I wanted to go to sleep. Had I been passed unnoticed, I should have frozen to death without knowing it. But, as good luck always attended me, Sergeant Madden came and, rousing me up, made me walk about.
At the end of Bear Tavern Road, Washington splits his army with Sullivan, taking his troops down the river road to the southern end of Trenton, and Greene and Washington heading to the northern end of town on Upper Ferry Road.
And our army then, with a quick step, pushing on upon both roads at the same time, entered the town.
The Hessians are outnumbered and outgunned and capitulate in less than an hour. Finding from our disposition that they were surrounded and that they must inevitably be cut to pieces if they made any further resistance, they agreed to lay down their arms. The number that submitted in this manner was 23 officers and 886 men. Colonel Rahl, the commanding officer, and 7 others were found wounded in the town. Knowing his troops were exhausted, Washington orders them back across the river with their Hessian prisoners and captured artillery and weapons.
He's in a position where he won a battle and then retreated, which is not what he wants to have people think about him. He's got to go back and be on the offensive again.
Generals Ewing and Cadwalader's brigades have crossed over the Delaware, and Washington's troops joined them on December 29th in Trenton to set up fortifications and defend against a British attack by Cornwallis.
He's going to fortify a hill in the southern part of Trenton that was going to be a good defensive position.
With enlistments expiring, Washington makes a heartfelt appeal to his troops to re-enlist for 6 weeks.
Your country is at stake. Your wives, your houses, and all that you hold dear. Cornwallis gathers his forces at this very hour across that creek. I realize you'll worn yourselves out with fatigues and hardships, but we know not how to spare you. I ask that any freedom-loving man who has decided to volunteer to stay on to poise his firelock and step forward.
Few soldiers step forward at first, but when Washington offers them a $10 bounty in silver coin if they re-enlist for 6 weeks, about half of the soldiers step forward.
These were the core group of men that he believed could do anything. And he also wanted to keep them around to sort of be the nucleus for a new army that was going to form around it in 1777.
Washington also receives notice that on December 27th, Congress had resolved to officially grant him full power over military affairs for 6 months. They have done me the honor to entrust me with powers in my military capacity of the highest nature and almost unlimited in extent. Washington realized this is a citizens' army and chooses not to abuse these dictatorial powers, but does make some changes to the terms of enlistment for the third establishment of the Continental Army in 1777. He informs his recruiters that a person who wants to enlist in the Continental Army must sign on for 3 years or the duration of the war, and he lifts the ban on free blacks, which allows them to enlist in 1777.
We served as soldiers, we served as sailors. Every job you can imagine, there was an African American there. Because George Washington, I have to give him credit, as the war went on, he saw the capabilities of some of the African American soldiers in his ranks. So he began to open his mind. And when he saw the service they were able to render, he did a 180.
Cornwallis gathers about 8,000 redcoats to march on Trenton to defeat Washington's army and end the rebellion.
The British want revenge for having lost the battle on the 26th.
But Washington wants another victory.
Washington fights a brilliant delaying fight. As the British march from Princeton to Trenton, he sends a force under Edward Hand to fire upon the British retreat, fire upon him and retreat.
Because of the delays, Cornwallis's vanguard doesn't arrive in Trenton until late afternoon on January 2nd, 1777.
The British vanguard attempts to cross the bridge in the twilight hours, and they're stopped 3 times by the artillery and musketmen and riflemen massed at the bridge area there.
By the time the rest of the British troops arrive, the sun has set, and Cornwallis decides to wait until morning to finish off the rebels. And at a council of war, Washington decides to take an unguarded back road to outflank Cornwallis and attack Princeton.
He leaves enough men to keep the campfires burning to deceive Cornwallis in Trenton that he's going to be there in the morning.
By morning, Washington and his army have reached the outskirts of Princeton when a chance encounter between General Hugh Mercer and a British regiment marching towards Trenton changes his plans.
These armies spotted each other and piecemeal rushed onto the field. It's an incredibly brutal start to the battle, and the beginning of the fighting comes to a dramatic conclusion when the British fix bayonets and charge into the orchard. Brigadier General Hugh Mercer is mortally wounded. Washington rallies the army, brings them back into line for the first time since the war began. We have militia not running away after they've been routed. Instead, they reform and are brought back onto the field. Washington leaps into action. He rides down the field, waving his sword, egging his men on. He says, "Parade with me now, my brave fellows. There are only a handful of the enemy, and we will have them directly." We see Washington riding between the lines, not behind his own troops. One officer wrote 1,000 deaths flew around him. It is Washington's first field victory. He won at Trenton, yes. He won at Second Trenton, yes. But those battles were street fighting, and they were fighting from behind earthworks. This is the first time the Continental Army has ever defeated British regulars in an open field engagement on ground that wasn't of anybody's choosing. It's an incredible moment for a cause that a week and a half ago, by Washington's own admission, was this close to going out.
Washington's troops attack Princeton and occupy Nassau Hall, taking prisoners and British weapons and supplies. Washington decides to take control of West Jersey and set up headquarters in Morristown.
When these armies do at last finally go into winter quarters, Washington does what Washington does best. He begins to spread out his army.
Along his route to Morristown, Washington assigned some of his regiments and militias to encampments at Middlebrook and Quibbletown.
Placing them in that area gives them the opportunity to protect assets that are necessary for the cause of the war, and also promoting the fact that the Army is not just interested in independence, but protecting the property rights of those who support independence, and also keeping a close eye on the British.
By taking control of West Jersey, the British encounter difficulties foraging for provisions and supplies for its army. They are endeavoring to draw in all the forage they can get, in the course of which they have daily skirmishes with our advance parties. But I think, do what they will, they must be distressed greatly before the winter is over. This was the start of the forage wars that took place throughout the winter and spring of 1777.
It's an incredibly important moment because the British, who are now on their back heels after having suffered the indignation of losing not once, not twice, but 3 times to Washington's army, now continue to lose a series of skirmishes.
An early victory for the Patriots took place on January 20th, when General Philemon Dickinson attacks a British foraging party at Somerset Courthouse and drives them back to New Brunswick. At the end of May, Washington moves his headquarters from Morristown to Middlebrook to assess the strength of his new Third Establishment Continental Army and state militias.
So the British are trying to draw Washington out, of course. They still believe that one decisive battle could smash and end the war there.
General Howe tries one more time to engage with the rebel army on June 26, 1777, in the Short Hills area near Middlebrook. The British fire cannon, and their troops' strength far outnumber Lord Stirling's brigade, who makes an orderly retreat back to Middlebrook.
From a military standpoint for Washington, it's not it's a defeat, but strategically long term, it does give the British some pause.
The Forage Wars have taken a toll on Howe's army.
It results in more casualties than you might expect. The Forage War will end with over 900 British casualties. So Howe, in losing the 10 crucial days and effectively losing the Forage War as well, loses control of New Jersey. And this most crucial state, the state between New York City and Philadelphia, is lost to him. He will never control it again.
As Washington watches Howe's army leave the shores of New Jersey from the heights above Quibbletown, these formative years have come to an end. The Patriots have confronted the mightiest nation in the world and survived. Never again would the Patriots' fight for independence be so vulnerable and so close to defeat as it was in the months leading up to Christmas, 1776. The extraordinary crossing on Christmas night and march to Trenton changed the course of the Patriots' fight for liberty. Over 10 crucial days, Washington turned defeats into victories that breathed new life into the Patriots' struggle to achieve independence from British rule. In the process, Washington grew into his role as commander-in-chief, regained the respect of his officers, and earned the admiration of his troops and American citizens as the founding father of this great nation.
Here I sit on Buttermilk Hill. Who can blame me? Cry my fill. Every tear would turn a meal. Johnny's gone for a soldier. Shoo, shoo, shoo-la-roon. Shoo-la-rock-shack, shoo-la-barbaloo. Oh, my darling, oh, my love. Gone the rainbow, gone the dove. Johnny was my only love. Johnny's gone for a soldier. Shoo, shoo, shoo-la-roon. Shoo-la-rock-shack, shoo-la-barbaloo. When I die for Sally Bobolink, come bibble in the moon, shine
Major funding for Road to Liberty Through Their Eyes was provided by the S. Dillard and Adrian Kirby Family Philanthropic Fund and by the Community Foundation of New Jersey, Princeton Partners, and the New Jersey Historic Trust. Additional funding was provided by the Kane Foundation, the F.M. Kirby Foundation, the New Jersey Historical Commission, the New Jersey Education Association, Edward E. and Mary M. Wendell, Jackie and Plato Stirius, and John T. Daniel.